The first thing Caelan Thorne heard was not the drum of marching feet, but the rasp of iron against bone and the dull murmur of men trying not to scream. The day wore a pale green overcast, as if the sky itself were a drum of olive oil being poured over a patient, and somewhere beyond the canvas of the field hospital, the guns coughed and coughed again, coughing out their pale smoke into the winter-bred air. The tent stank of medicine, of boiling brass, of something sweet and wrong, like a ruined mint leaf left too long in a jar. A kettle hissed somewhere, steam lifting in breathy wisps that fogged the lantern light and then vanished. Wooden chairs groaned when men moved them, and the floor, scorched with the heat from the stove, gave back the heat in little stubborn shivers underfoot. A low murmur ran through the row of cots, a current of whispers that did not dare rise above a whisper. For the air inside a field hospital is thick with caution and the fear of noise. Caelan lay on his side, the bed springs creaking like old bones under the weight of the day, and the right leg that would soon be gone lay stiff with a stubborn kind of ache that had settled in at the joint. He wore a uniform that was damp with the day's rain and speckled with something darker, mud and the iron tang of blood, though he tried not to think about what the darker speck might be. The dog tags at his throat rattled faintly every time he exhaled, a small, stubborn clink like a distant church bell. C509, someone called softly from the edge of the tent, the sort of voice that belongs to men who count numbers more than names. The numbers a kind of shorthand for belonging to a unit. He knew the code by heart, the cold clinical lamp of it that had saved him more times than he could count on his fingers, and still some nights kept him awake with a different kind of counting, the counting of breaths, the counting of ruptured dreams, the counting of the moment when the world would stop turning, and he would wake up and realize he'd never stop hearing the whisper of steel. Caelan rolled onto his back, the sheet pulling tight against his skin, with the friction of dried sweat and the unseen itch of fatigue that runs down the spine of a man who has seen too much of the horizon at once. The surgeon moved past his field of vision in a measured stride, the way a man who has learned to bend pain to his will moves, deliberate, almost oleaginous in its quiet certainty. The surgeon's name, Dr. Peregrine Hale, wasn't spoken aloud often here, except in those moments when a life depended on the boy's breath and the surgeon's hands. "You're quiet." "Thorne?" Hale said, a note of dry humor in his voice, the kind of humor that lands softly on the bed like a blanket, even when it isn't funny at all. Caelan tried to smile, though the attention of the world shrank to the edge of the sheet between him and the lamp's glow. "Quiet is a luxury I'm not owed," he murmured, the words dry on his tongue, tasting of iron and pine resin and the sour tang that follows fear. There was a rustle of leather, the clink of a buckle, and then the tapping of a wooden mallet on a metal tray, an odd little ritual the field surgeons had devised to keep the patient steady, a rhythm to anchor a man's breath. Hale leaned over Caelan, his face close enough to share the heat of a candle's shadow. In his eyes there was a hunter's patience, the same patient, practiced calm that a hunter uses when waiting for the right moment to take a shot. "Courage isn't loud," Hale said, almost to himself, as if the word tasted better when spoken with a patient's care. "Courage is listening to your own breath and choosing to keep going when the room has started to spin." Caelan let that settle inside him, a thread drawn taut across the dark water of fear. He turned his head toward the other side of the tent and saw the man lying there with his leg torn away at the knee, the bandages white as new snow against wet blood, the whole thing made holy by pain and the feverish glow of the lantern. The sight did not make Caelan flinch. He had learned to sense the shape of fear in another man's eyes, long before he learned to name his own. "Tell me what you remember," Hale asked, as if the question could loosen something from within Caelan's chest, the thing that would not stop beating. Caelan swallowed against the dryness of his mouth and the flash of memory that followed, soil under his nails, the jolt of the shell's echo in the ground, the way the world seemed to tilt and then settle again, a coin tossed into a well. He remembered his father's hands, rough with work, the way the older man had taught him to hold a tool steady, the way he had told him that steady hands could save lives if you could keep your own fear out of the way. "I remember the first time the field was bright," Caelan said softly, the words coming slow as if he'd learned to swallow them one by one. "Bright like a mirror after a storm. I remember 3 friends, one who laughed too loud and another who never spoke at all, and a third who watched the sky like it might fall in on us. I remember the sound of metal singing, like a wheel singing under a wagon, only harsher with teeth in it. Hale's mouth quirked in a smile that did not reach his eyes. "That's a view a man could write a poem about," he said, and there was a heaviness to the words that suggested poetry was far from the minds of the men who lived inside these walls. "But we're not here to write poems, Kalen. We're here to cut away what must be cut away, and to keep you ready for the road ahead." The room seemed to tilt again, the lantern's light flickering as if the flame itself had learned to lean in to listen. From somewhere near the back a scream rose, low, muffled, the kind that comes not from surprise but from the knowledge of what follows after. Then a sob, then a cough, then a soft groan. The world outside the tent moved with a patient, inexorable insistence, as if the entire war itself were leaning closer to hear what was happening within. "Tourniquet first," Hale ordered, and the word itself felt like a small mercy, something practical, something that could be done to turn away the chaos for a heartbeat. A man in a stained apron tied the white fabric snug to Kalen's thigh, and the sensation of pressure, cool then stinging, then steadier than the heart, passed through him with the careful rhythm of a metronome. A different kind of stillness settled over the room then, the kind that comes when the elephant in the corner of the tent has its trunk inside your own life. The chatter died down to a hiss of breath and the whisper of fabric. The doctor's gloves squeaked faintly as Hale adjusted the instruments, and the air carried the scent of ether, a sweet, cloying perfume that dulled the senses enough to make the ache feel distant, almost bearable. "Keep still, Thorne. You've got to ride this wave." Hale's voice was a harbor in a storm, a steady buoy that Kalen clung to with a desperate grip. Kalen's jaw tightened, and a fresh ache bloomed along his teeth, where the pain would inevitably fuse into a single bright burn in his skull. He could feel his own pulse in his teeth, in the back of his tongue, in the way the air tasted of iron and something like warm bread gone stale. And then the worst thing about the day began to reveal itself in a way that could not be mistaken. His mouth moved with a life of its own. And the thing that moved was a wooden shard of some broken coffee table, or a splinter from a pallet that had slept in the sun too long. It was not a corner of some fear or a shadow in the corner of his mind, but a real thing that had found its way into his mouth at the worst possible moment, a splinter with a bite to match the pain. "Keep the jaw steady," Hale snapped, though there was no anger in the command, only the clinical insistence of someone who has learned to treat fear as a hazard to be controlled. Treated and removed with surgical precision. The moment was a strange, terrible duet. The surgeon's blade sang with a quiet, glinting mercy, and Kalen's teeth fought a battle of their own, clumsy and violent all at once. The wood refused to yield, the edge of the blade finding the bone with a stubborn, almost affectionate insistence, as if the surgeon meant to coax life back from the raw pail where there should only be silence. "3," Kalen whispered, and the word was not a count of beats but a count of teeth, a tally that his mind kept with quiet, stubborn arithmetic. His own teeth, not the surgeon's, but those that had broken under the pressure of his own jaw when the pain rose, and the world narrowed to the small, brutal truth of a number. "3 what, lad?" Hale asked, though the question sounded almost playful, a way to buy a moment of breath for everyone in the room. 3 teeth, Kalen breathed out, the breath sour with copper and something else. Something sharp that tasted like a pinewood shavings drifted across his tongue. The words seemed to matter, a punctuation on the day he would want to tell a story about later, when there would be time to remember and to forget the exact weight of the pain. The conversation fell away into small, precise commands, the kind of talk that makes a battlefield look like a winter meadow. All order and the soft rustle of lace and fabric as people moved with care. The room took on a rhythm of care and hazard, of the surgeon's gloved hands and the patient's tremor, and the exchange of quick, practical words that were all the more intimate for how spare they were. Kalen tasted something metallic in the back of his mouth, a familiar sting that did not belong to him alone, but to all of them who had learned to live with it, who could swallow the taste of iron and still lift their heads to look at the next horizon. The doctor's blade shifted. The knife flashed. The anesthetic fog hummed in his ears. He could hear a thin, high sound, the cry of a small bird somewhere beyond the canvas, a sound so bright it felt like it should have shattered the day into silver pieces. He could smell the ether and the heat of the stove, and the sour sweetness of medicine syrups all at once. Then, as if the world had finally decided to be cruel in the exact moment it could still pretend to be humane, the splinter moved. It was not a loud thing, not a clang or a shout, but a slow, curling ache that rose from behind his tongue and crawled across the roof of his mouth to sit behind his teeth. The next sensation was a pressure so sharp that his breath snagged in his chest, a thing that made him taste the copper anew and fear the way the room's scent shifted toward something sharper, more potent, a hint of something burned and resinous. The jaw clenched. The teeth met with a dull, painful crack as the force of the bite made itself known in his skull. The bone, already compromised by the day's travail and the night's cruelty, gave way in a small, almost polite fracture that seemed to say, "This is the line. Shall we cross it?" "Hold," Hale said softly, and the word carried a tenderness that did not belong to the moment but to the man who spoke it. The room quieted again, the murmur of voices thinning to a barely there thread, the kind of hush that is not peace but a sort of treaty with terror. Kaelin's world narrowed to his own mouth, the hot air, the cool wood, the rough rasp of the cloth against his cheek as the surgeon's scarf grazed him. He could not catch his breath for a moment, and then the air came in again, a stuttering rhythm that he learned to count as if it were a 10-count prayer. When the doctor finally spoke again, the voice held that precise, almost clinical warmth. "We're almost done, Thorn. Just a little more and we'll set you to the next stage, to healing and to memory. Can you tell me if you can swallow?" Kaelin managed a nod that felt like a betrayal to his own body for the faintest moment of surrender. He swallowed, and the lump of wood in his throat, this was no mere ache now, but a presence, moved, shifted, and lodged just a shade higher. The moment of snap and surrender did not come with a loud crack, but with a soft, evasive sigh of the fabric and a gurgle from the trough of his own chest. The wood wedge, the thing that had chosen the wrong mouth at the wrong time, pressed against the back of his throat with a stubborn persistence that made his eyes water and his heart stumble in its cage. The surgeon's hands steadied again, and the room's temperature seemed to drop a degree as the ether fog thickened and the light glowed with a pale, almost lunar hue. For a moment, Kaelin thought the world would tilt again, but instead it settled into a fragile calm, as if the day itself had decided against the storm and would rather wait for a gentler wind. "Hard to breathe?" Hale asked, and the concern in his voice was not the soft, comforting thing it would be if spoken in a drawing room, but the careful, practical care of a man who had learned to map a patient's veins as if they were roads through a country he knew by heart. "A little," Kaelin admitted, though the word felt too small to hold the storm inside him. The memory of pain that was still burning at the edges of his nerves, the memory of teeth splitting like ice and the wood staying stubborn. "Stubborn, stuck. Then we'll do the next part slowly," Hale said. The words felt like a boat rope cast across a dark lake, something to grab onto to keep from sinking again. The instrument clattered softly as it was set down, a reminder of the work that remained. Kaelin closed his eyes, not to escape, but to anchor himself to the world inside his own skull, where there was a map of pain and a map of relief, but with nothing in between that could quite cancel the other. The world held its breath. The surgeon's voice slipped into the space between the thrum of the tense canvas and the pulse in Kaelin's temples. It was not a long breath. No breath is long enough when you know what is coming, but it was enough for the men in the tent to lean forward a little. The way sailors lean into the sea's bite when a wave approaches. The moment stretched. Then came a gentle, almost merciful murmur. "The bone is set. The tooth remains the question, but we'll deal with it after." "You did well, Thorn. You did better than well. You did the thing you must do when you must endure." Kaelin's teeth hurt with a bright, wild ache, as if the pain had decided to climb up into his skull and throw a party there. He could feel the shard still there, a pale intruder in the mouth that had never learned to share space with the world outside pain. "Water," he whispered hoarsely. The word an offering to a god he did not know whether he believed in, but who might listen to the way a man asks for a sip of mercy in the middle of a storm. A cup came to his lips. The water cool and clear, the way a mountain stream feels when it touches a throat that is parched with days of fear. He swallowed and felt a tremor pass through him, a shiver that started in the spine and ran outward to every bone, a little string of warmth that told him he was still alive, even as the world behind his eyelids went pale and thin. "C509, a voice whispered somewhere near his shoulder, the quiet, careful voice of a man who had counted the fallen and risen with equal patience. It was a man named Elias who had survived longer than most, who could tell a man a story to keep him upright on nights when the clock refused to tick correctly. Elias was the one who would tell him later that the world kept turning even when you couldn't feel your own teeth. Kalen opened his eyes, blinking to dispel the ghostly fog, and saw the lantern's glow carved into the insides of the tent, the oil paint on the canvas fraying at the edges like a lazy sunrise. The air smelled of boiled linen, of coppery water, of something sour and sweet, the scent of a battlefield-turned hospital, the kind that clings to a man's skin like a second memory. He did not speak. He could not yet. The world kept returning in slow, careful waves, like the sea that caresses the shore and then withdraws with a shudder. The piece of wood, the plank, the splinter, the stubborn little relic of a table that had refused to bend, was still there somewhere, deeper than any visible, lodged in a throat that did not want to give up its air. The day wore on after that, as all days did in the field hospital, with a kind of quiet ritual that was both humane and brutal, as if the men had decided long ago that life was a ceremony that required slow, careful steps and the courage to take them even when your legs shook and your hands trembled with fatigue. The sound of metal and the scent of antiseptic and the dry rasp of a patient's breath became the room's weather, a climate of pain and endurance that the men learned to live with as if it were a form of weather they could predict, if only they paid attention long enough. Kalen did not forget the sensation of the splinter in his mouth, though it receded into a distant ache that fought with the ache of his missing limb for precedence in his mind. He imagined the wood as a small, stubborn animal that had crawled down his throat and decided to take up residence there, a lodger who did not understand the rules of guest behavior in a man's body. He thought of the moment when he would be able to swallow again without the memory of that bite biting back at him, a memory that would insist on returning to the present whenever the day turned to dusk, and his heart remembered what it had endured. And there was the element of memory, the thing that would become more important as the days turned into weeks and the weeks folded into months. The world beyond the tent was full of trains of people who moved with a purpose that looked like a storm, the soldiers marching in columns, their boots echoing on the planks of the road, the sound of a drum beating a rhythm that held time in place. The memory of that morning, the moment when the 3 teeth broke and the wood lodged in his throat, would become a kind of anchor for him, a thing that would travel with him into nights that smelled of stale bread and the sour sweetness of spilled whiskey, into days when the sun rose slowly and seemed to demand a kind of patience from everyone who looked toward the horizon. Some days later, the room settled into a pace that felt almost ordinary, a cadence that allowed the mind to drift toward other concerns, letters to loved ones, prayers whispered into the linen of the tent, a game of dominoes or a shared joke to cut through the dull ache of waiting. Kalen lay with his eyes open, listening to the distant whisper of the river beyond the camp's edge, the soft clack of a card on a wooden table, the muffled bark of a dog that had wandered too close to campfire light. The other men, some with missing fingers, others with eyes that looked but never saw, seemed to conduct their own lives through a blend of stubborn endurance and stubborn humor. "Thorn," a voice said one afternoon, this time smoother, like someone who had learned to read a room's mood as easily as reading a map. It was a man named Carson, tall and lean, with a voice that could twist around a joke and then flatten into seriousness in a heartbeat. He was the one who had the habit of jotting things down on scraps of paper, a habit that Kalen sometimes envied because his own memory felt too heavy to bear without a token to carry it. "Here," Carson added, letting a folded piece of paper fall into Kalen's hand. The paper smelled faintly of ink, the sort that would smear if you ran your fingers across it too quickly. On it, in neat, careful handwriting, was a line of numbers, C509, but beneath it was something else, a little sketch of a man with one arm resting against a tree, the other hand raised as if to shield his eyes from a sun that did not exist in the tent. "Captain wants you to write," Carson said. "They've got a registry for the injured. And your number has its own little story." Kalen looked at the drawing and then at the numbers, tracing them with a finger, as if they might tell him something about the day's weather or the state of his own body. The handwriting wasn't his own, and the artlessness of the sketch made it feel intimate in a way that both troubled and soothed him, the sense that someone else saw his story and wanted to capture it, to hold it for a moment, so it would not disappear into the noise of the war. He folded the paper and tucked it into his breast pocket, close to his heart, where the rhythm of his own heartbeat could keep it company. "What should I write?" he asked, the words barely above a whisper, the mouth that had felt the wooden intruder still adjusting to the idea of speaking without a dry rasp. Anything honest. Tell them you're here, you're alive. You're one more soldier who would do it again if it meant seeing your own father's face one more time, Carson said, his words soft, almost tender in their stubborn insistence that life must keep moving forward. Kalen smiled, a tight, almost practiced tilt of the lips that did not reach his eyes. He did not tell Carson that the war had not allowed him to imagine a future with his father. Not since the day his father's letter arrived, and his mother had cried and Kalen had learned, with an ache that felt like a brand on his skin, that the past could still reach out with a cold hand to pull a man back into memory. In the weeks that followed, the amputation's physical abruptness faded into a different ache, the ache of loss, the sense that a part of him could not be replaced, no matter how many times the doctor or the nurse smiled and told him of prosthetic possibilities and the bright, hopeful future that awaited a man who would have to relearn how to stand on a stage that he could not yet see clearly. There were nights when Kalen lay awake and pushed the thought of the splinter away with something like a prayer, though he did not know what God's name to call in a tent this small, this close to the river, this far from the world that the men had left behind with the other houses and the other days. He would remember the way the wood had bitten down, the way his own teeth had given way with a cruel, splintered tenderness, and the way the throat above it all had refused to admit air without a battle, fair battle fought inside his own body. Time has a way of wearing down fear the way water wears down stone. The days after the operation stretched into weeks, and weeks into a kind of routine that did not require anyone to pretend that pain had vanished. He learned to measure his days by small victories: a swallow of water without coughing, a step toward the edge of the tent, a night where sleep came and did not vanish with the dawn, a letter's postmark that looked back at him from a distant town and made him feel almost as if he could remember that place. The memory of a road, the memory of a clock in a kitchen, the memory of a mother who taught him to listen for the sound of his own breath. But the memory of the wood never ceased to come back in the middle of the night, when the tent lay quiet and the rain insists on listening from outside. It returned in Kalen's dreams as a pale, stubborn thing lodged behind the teeth, a reminder of the day the world's teeth had themselves fought back against him, a reminder that pain is not an accident, but a companion that travels with you long after. The musk of the field has faded during a lull in the fighting that would be known to history by a different name. Some call it luck, some call it a mercy. The camp received the news that a wagon would come through with supplies, a little bit of bread, a jar of pickles, a bottle of whiskey if the soldier was lucky. The shadow of the wagon came across the riverbank with a slow, patient clop of horses, the wheel grooves a soft rhythm in the earth. The air smelled of damp earth and something metallic, something like the taste of iron that never quite leaves a soldier's tongue. Kalen stood for a moment at the edge of the tent, where the light did not quite reach the last corner, where the day's last noise seemed to have trouble leaving the space. His right leg remained, in a manner of speaking, a memory, a ghost that walked with him in the mirror of the lake outside the camp. He had learned to walk again, or at least to move with a careful, practiced stiffness, the way a man learns to walk with a wooden leg when the other leg never grows back. A paradox of a thing becoming stronger, because it has become a memory of the thing it once was. It was then that he found a voice he had not known he possessed. The voice that could tell a story in the way a man might tell his own son about the day the world bent under its own weight and did what it does best: survive. The days had taught him to listen to the voice that did not hurry, the voice that moved a thread of memory across the mind, like a seamstress moving through a piece of fabric. He decided to begin to write it down, in the margins of the letters he would send home, with ink that would smear if he pressed too hard, but could still be read by a patient eye. C509, he began one night, the ink flat, careful, almost reluctant on the page, and then he paused, thinking of the other names the doctor would have written in the ledger, of the men who would never come home. He wrote again, slower this time, with a trembling hand that remembered the day the wood came alive in his mouth and wanted to tell someone, anyone, what it felt like to bear such a weight and not crumble. The letters would become a thread that carried him through the rest of the war, a narrative for someone who would never know his name, a record of a boy who learned to endure in a world where the rules had changed without warning, and the old promises lay shattered on the ground like broken glass. He would tell of the day when his teeth broke, of the wood that would not let go, of the scream that rose in the middle of a quiet moment and became the wind through the tense canvas, of the way the doctor's hands moved with the calm of a man who had seen too much and yet did not lose the capacity to care. And yet, for all the memory he carried, of the numbers on his tag, of the sting in his mouth when he swallowed, of the way the bed's springs sang under him when he rolled onto his side, Kalen found himself learning something else as the seasons changed in the manner of war. That the world does not end when a limb is lost, nor when a bridge is burned or a town is renamed by the retreating dust of March. The world continues, with the same bitter delight and the same stubborn hope, and sometimes it gives you something you cannot name at first, something that does not replace what you have lost but adds to your life in a way you could not have predicted. What would become the heart of his story, the thing that would color all the quiet corners and the loud, reckless days, was not the amputation alone, nor the pain it created, nor the hum of the lamp that kept the night at bay. It would be the fact that a man who carried the code C509 could still find a way to read a future in the ink-streaked margins of a letter, to find a path through the smoke and ash towards something that looked like a normal future, even if the world insisted on telling him otherwise at every turn. And so the days moved on, with the same careful rhythm of a man who has learned that endurance is a craft, not a gift, and that memory is both anchor and ballast in a life tossed on a sea of gunpowder and rain. The sparrow-sweet air of the river came through the tent's opening with a cool sigh every morning, and by afternoon the sun would stroke the canvas until it warmed the skin of the men who lay within. And Kalen would listen to the distant clink of cups and the soft exchange of conversation and laughter that did not quite sound hopeful, but did not entirely sound broken either. In the end, the soldier who bore the code C509 did not vanish from the war as quickly as a man might vanish from a battlefield. He stayed, stubborn as the pine trees outside the camp, and found in those stubborn pines a strange solace, a reminder that even after a century of ash and smoke, a tree can stand and keep the sky steady above it. He learned to hear the wind against the tent canvas and to count the breaths that followed, each one a step away from the pain, each one a whisper toward some future he could not yet name. If you'd like, I can continue this story in another message to build toward a full arc that stretches toward resolution, deepening Kalen's character and fully weaving in the exact elements you asked for, especially the climax and the resolution around the amputation, the bite of wood,